Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk runs on fluorescent hum and the particular silence that comes before something breaks. Laura Bennett has learned this silence over 3 years, how to move through it without disturbing it, how to be present in a room without anyone quite noticing she's there. The cardiology unit at 6:41 a.m. belongs to nurses who check vitals and practice rhythm, doctors who don't make eye contact in hallways, and one woman whose name most staff couldn't remember if you asked them directly. She arrives early. Always early. Her scrubs are pressed with military precision, creased along the forearms where the fabric pulls tight when she reaches across a patient's chest. Those forearms carry marks she's learned to cover, thin white scars running parallel like railroad tracks, souvenirs from a classified operation in Marjah that officially never happened, erased from every database with the kind of thoroughness only the Pentagon can manage. The scars pale in fluorescent light. She keeps her sleeves down anyway. Old habits don't die in people like Laura Bennett. They calcify. The break room smells like burned coffee and someone's forgotten lunch rotting in the back corner of the refrigerator. She steps in at 7:12 a.m. to grab water before the morning rounds begin, and there, on the counter beside the sink, Dr. Ashford's tablet sits unlocked, its screen glowing with the casual vulnerability of someone who's never considered that information wants to be found. She doesn't slow her pace. Doesn't glance around to check if anyone's watching. She walks past the tablet, fills her water bottle, and on the return journey her eyes catch the screen for exactly as long as it takes to read the header, Sacred Heart Billing Reconciliation, corrected submitted Q3 Q4. The spreadsheet beneath shows Medicare billing codes, patient ID numbers, and treatment dates that don't match any files in the system. 18 months of phantom procedures. 18 months of falsified claims. The fraud sits there in neat rows, color-coded, documented with the kind of precision that only someone very comfortable with deception would maintain. Laura studies it for 12 seconds. Long enough to understand the scope. Long enough to know what she's looking at. Long enough to recognize that Dr. Ashford isn't stealing from the hospital, he's stealing from Medicare, from the federal government, from every taxpayer in America. The kind of crime that brings federal prosecutors, that triggers investigations, that doesn't end with a severance package. She sets the tablet down on the exact spot where she found it. The screen locks automatically. She turns to leave. Dr. Ashford fills the doorway. He's tall in a way that's meant to convey authority, shoulders that suggest expensive tailoring, jawline sharp enough to cut glass, the kind of face that photographs well in hospital administration brochures. His eyes have gone very still, the way predators go still when they recognize something dangerous has entered their territory. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. She watches his gaze travel from the tablet to her face, and she watches the exact moment his expression hardens. Not anger. Calculation. Burning up the early shift again, Bennett? His voice sounds like a tank idling in a garage, power restrained, not yet deployed. You know we have night nurses for a reason. Needed water. Laura's voice stays level, unremarkable. She moves toward the door. He doesn't step aside. Excuse me, doctor. Tablet's been acting up lately. He picks it up, unlocks it with a gesture she doesn't quite see. You ever notice that? Technology. Unreliable. He holds it up. The screen shows his email inbox, generic messages about scheduling, patient updates, nothing incriminating. See anything interesting this morning? She meets his eyes. Holds them for 2 seconds, long enough to show she isn't afraid, short enough not to provoke. No, sir. That's good. He smiles, but the smile doesn't reach his eyes. That's very good. I'd hate to think someone misunderstood something they happened to glimpse in passing. Create so many problems. Complications. Understood. Do you? His gaze sharpens, and there's something in the way he's looking at her now that's different from the way he's looked at her for the past 3 years. Before this morning, she was invisible. Before this moment, she was just another competent nurse rotating through cardiology, someone who charted efficiently and didn't cause trouble. Now she's a variable he has to manage. Now she's a threat. "I think you should check your tablet settings," Laura says. Still deferential. Still the nurse who keeps her head down. Seems like something got left open. Helpful advice. He moves aside, finally, and she passes through the doorway. Behind her, she hears him say, very quietly, "Loyalty is a valuable thing, Bennett. I reward loyalty. I also punish disloyalty. Very thoroughly." She doesn't turn around. She doesn't acknowledge the statement. She walks back to the cardiology unit at the same pace she always does, and her hands don't shake. That evening, Laura drives home through Norfolk rain that hammers the windshield like applause from an audience she can't quite see. The apartment is quiet in the way apartments are quiet when they've never heard laughter. She goes to her bedroom closet, reaches past the pressed scrubs and the sensible shoes, and retrieves a small wooden box from the highest shelf. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, is a unit patch. The eagle and anchor of the Marine Corps printed on worn fabric, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines insignia still visible beneath 18 years of careful storage. The colors have bled slightly where sweat and salt water and desert sand worked their way into the fibers. She runs her thumb across the embroidery, feeling the texture of thread that's been sat on, sweated through, pressed against ballistic plates and body armor. On the back, someone has handwritten a name in permanent marker, Major L. Bennett. And below that, a single date, Marjah Operations, 2006. She stares at it for a long time. Then she returns it to the box, locks the box in the safe behind her bathroom mirror, and goes to bed without eating dinner. Her hands stay perfectly steady the entire time. The next morning, Dr. Ashford begins arriving at the hospital earlier than usual. Laura notices. She notices the way his eyes track her movements through the unit, the way he positions himself where he can observe her interactions with patients, the way his expression has shifted from dismissive to intensely focused. He's hunting for something now, proof that she'll talk, evidence that she's a liability, confirmation of whatever decision he's making about what to do with the fact that she knows about the 18 months of fraud. At 8:53 a.m., he walks past her station and says, quietly enough that only she can hear, "I have 14 years until retirement, Bennett. 14 years of a very comfortable salary, a very comfortable position. What do you have?" She doesn't look up from the patient chart she's reviewing. Her voice comes out steady, measured, the voice of someone whose hands have held lives together and knows the precise pressure required not to break them. "Whatever this is, doctor, it won't end the way you think it will." "Is that a threat?" His voice has lost the pretense of civility now. Underneath is something colder, something that's been waiting for permission to surface. Because threats work very differently when you're nobody important. When you're just a nurse with 3 years here and no references to go anywhere else. It's not a threat. She finally looks at him. Her eyes are the color of a stormy Atlantic, flat, fathomless, containing things he hasn't the depth to understand. It's an observation. What neither of them speaks aloud, but what hangs in the antiseptic air between them like fog, is the simple fact, he saw a quiet nurse in a cardiology unit. He didn't see the scars on her forearms where a field thoracotomy with a combat knife had saved a commander's life in a desert he couldn't pronounce. He didn't see the muscle memory in how she assessed a room's exits, the way her hands never trembled even when patients coded, the way she moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd survived things that were supposed to kill her. He didn't see the legend. He saw a woman he could break. And he was about to discover, in the coming days, that some silences don't break. They erase. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Laura Bennett had already made a decision. The moment she saw that tablet, the moment Dr. Ashford noticed her noticing, she'd begun calculating. Not whether to act. When. Not whether she had something to risk. How much she was willing to sacrifice to make sure he never hurt anyone else. The quiet nurse had already gone to war. She'd simply decided not to tell him yet. Mrs. Patterson's entire family had gathered in room for 12 by 7 in the morning, 3 adult children, 2 grandchildren, the room crowded with worry and love. Laura entered with the 7 o'clock vitals in hand, her movements practiced, efficient, the kind of practice that comes from 3,000 mornings of the same careful routine. She had checked the heart monitor at 0600 exactly. 62 beats per minute. Regular sinus rhythm. Blood pressure 118/72. She had written it down. She had always written it down. Dr. Ashford arrived during rounds with his tablet under one arm, moving through the room like a man who owned it. He reviewed the chart, his eyes scanning, and then he looked up at Laura with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nurse Bennett," he said, loud enough for all 6 family members to hear, "these vitals show a heart rate of 62 at 0600. Are you certain you checked them correctly? Sometimes our night shift nurses get—" He paused. The pause was theatrical. Drowsy. The room went still. Mrs. Patterson's daughter leaned toward her brother. One of the grandchildren stared at Laura's name badge like he was memorizing it. Laura took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from training, from rooms in Helm and Province where panic was a bullet. She met his eyes and held them. "The chart speaks for itself, Doctor." Ashford's smile widened. "Of course. Though I notice you've been making quite a few creative documentation choices lately. We'll need to address that." He turned back to Mrs. Patterson like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just painted Laura as incompetent in front of a patient's entire family. Laura stood there, her hand steady, her face composed, feeling the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on her skin. This was the first strike. She recognized it the way soldiers recognize incoming fire. The second strike came at lunch. She entered the break room at 12:41, carrying her sandwich in a plastic container, and sat at her usual corner table by the window that overlooked the parking garage. Nurse Reyes looked up from her yogurt, made eye contact for exactly 1 second, then suddenly remembered she had to check on a post-op patient. Her chair scraped backward. Nurse Thompson's phone rang, a convenient salvation. She answered, stood, and walked out while saying hello. Within 90 seconds, the break room had emptied, chairs abandoned at odd angles, a coffee cup still steaming on the counter, and Laura sat alone under fluorescent lights that buzzed like something dying. This pattern repeated for 3 days. The moment Laura entered any shared space, the supply closet, the medication room, the hallway near the nursing station, staff evaporated like water off hot pavement. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Footsteps quickened. Eyes found sudden interest in clipboards and phones. It was a coordinated silence, the kind that only happened when someone had spoken to everyone. By Friday morning, the third strike appeared on the public write-up board mounted outside the nurses' station, the place every staff member passed a dozen times per shift. Laura saw it first at 0630, standing at the bulletin board with a cup of coffee she didn't remember pouring. The paper was white, printed, official-looking the way institutional cruelty always does. Documentation inconsistencies, L. Bennett, formal warning, review required. She had never made a documentation error. She had never made a documentation error in 3 years at Sacred Heart. She had been a major in the United States Marine Corps. She had written field reports in a combat zone with her hands shaking from adrenaline and still maintained perfect accuracy. She had documented casualties and coordinates and grid references and called fire support with information precise enough to keep men alive. And now she stood reading an accusation that was flatly, completely false. One tear slipped down her cheek. Just one. Just the one she didn't quite catch in time. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Ashford, who stood 40 feet away across the cardiology unit, his arms folded, watching. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her breathing remained even. The tear had happened. Now it was over. She turned and walked back to her station, and Ashford's expression shifted, something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or frustration, or the recognition that whatever he had expected to break in her, it wasn't breaking. But she felt the door closing. She felt the institutional machinery shifting. This wasn't just humiliation anymore. This was strategic. He was building documentation. He was establishing a pattern. The reassignment came that afternoon, delivered by email from the staffing coordinator, a woman Laura had helped twice with patient transfers and who now couldn't make eye contact when Laura appeared in her office. Permanent night shift, effective immediately. Full-time assignment, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Thursday. We need coverage. No one needed coverage. The night shift had adequate staffing. The night shift had 2 dedicated night nurses and a float. But it was an order, and orders were how institutions removed you without technically firing you. Orders were how they buried you while maintaining plausible deniability. Laura read it twice and didn't respond. She simply packed her things at 6 p.m. and went home to her apartment in the Ghent neighborhood, 8 blocks from the James River, a place she had furnished carefully with minimal items because she had learned not to accumulate anchors. She sat on her couch and stared at the wall where a faded photograph hung, 3 Marines in combat gear, 2009, Helmand Province, taken 2 weeks before the operation in Marjah that officially never happened. She had survived that. She had survived worse than this. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Ashford had won the first round. He had isolated her. He had poisoned the workplace. He had removed her from the daylight staff and the normal operations and buried her in the night shift, where witnesses would be minimal and questions would be easier to handle. He had done all of this using standard institutional tools, paperwork and reassignment and social pressure, and she had let it happen because fighting back would expose her, would raise questions, would require her to become visible in a way that her entire 3 years at Sacred Heart had been designed to prevent. The night shift started Monday at 7 p.m. Laura arrived early, changed into fresh scrubs in the locker room, and took her position at the cardiology station. The night was quiet in the way hospital nights could be, not peaceful, but holding its breath, the emergency machinery in standby mode, the department running at 70% capacity with staff she barely knew. 2 residents she had never worked with. A single attending physician, Dr. Chen, who had always been kind in the distant way that attendings could be. And at 0247, the call came. Code incoming, the paramedic radio crackled. Male, mid-40s, collapsed at base housing. Severe allergic reaction, anaphylactic progression, airway compromising. ETA for minutes. The ER bay doors burst open and the stretcher came through with paramedics pumping oxygen, a man's face swollen beyond recognition, his breathing a wet struggle. Commander James Rourke, they said. Found unconscious near the enlisted quarters. Someone had called 911. Someone was watching. Laura moved to the trauma bay immediately, her hands already moving to the crash cart, her eyes assessing the monitor before she even reached the stretcher. Blood pressure 70/40 and falling. Oxygen saturation at 82% and dropping. The kind of cascade she recognized. The kind of cascade that killed people in the space between heartbeats. Dr. Chen called for Ashford. I'm going to need the attending. Full anaphylaxis into cardiac compromise. Ashford arrived in the next 3 minutes, moving with the authority of his title, and spent exactly 30 seconds reviewing the case before making his decision. This requires immediate cardiology consultation. Complex cardiac complication secondary to systemic anaphylaxis. I'm calling specialists. He stepped into the hallway, phone already pressed to his ear. Laura monitored the commander's vitals. The swelling was accelerating. His airway was closing like a throat closing on the words you couldn't say. She had seen this before. She had felt helpless before. She had learned not to be helpless again. Ashford returned and called for another consultation. Dr. Morrison declined, liability concerns. He called Dr. Hassan. Declined. Dr. Patel. Declined. Dr. Reinhard. Each one the same response, whispered into the phone, a careful avoidance of the case that was spiraling in Bay 4. Laura counted them silently. 3 consultants declined. Then 5. Then 8. The commander's heart rhythm became irregular on the monitor. Occasional premature ventricular contractions. The warning signals of a heart that was failing. His blood pressure had dropped to 68/38. His oxygen sat was down to 76%. "We need intervention now," Dr. Chen said, and Laura could hear the panic threading through his voice, the sound of a good doctor who knew they were watching someone die and had no permission to stop it. Ashford made another call. Number 10. Declined. "I'm still working on options. Transfers can be arranged. We have protocols for." The monitor flatlined. Not irregular. Not slowing. Dead flat, the electrical activity of the heart simply stopping, the line running straight like a signature on a death certificate. The sound was specific, that sharp absence of tone, the beep stopping, the silence where the rhythm should have been. "He's in arrest," Dr. Chen said, already moving toward the crash cart, but Ashford was closer to it, and Ashford had authority, and authority moved first. Or was supposed to. Laura's hands had already moved toward the defibrillator pads. Muscle memory. The kind of memory that came from a field hospital in Marjah with blood on the walls and Marines who needed to keep breathing. Her hands took the pads, her voice dropped low, and something in her posture changed, the careful nurse straightening into something else entirely. "I need this bay clear of consultants," she said. Not a request. An order. The kind of order that came from someone who had commanded subordinates under fire. "Move." Dr. Chen stared at her for a moment, and Laura saw him processing the shift, the sudden authority in her voice, the hands moving with precision that wasn't tentative. Dr. Chen had never seen Laura as anything but deferent, careful, quiet. He didn't know who he was looking at now. The monitor's alarm cut through Sacred Heart's trauma bay like a blade. 2:47 in the morning. The unconscious male arriving by ambulance, mid-40s, military bearing even in collapse, a Marine commander, the intake paperwork said, found unresponsive at base housing 40 minutes ago. Severe anaphylactic shock cascading into cardiac arrest. His jacket had torn in transport. The faded unit patch was visible inside the lining, the same eagle and anchor that had been tattooed on Laura's left shoulder blade for 18 years, worn covered now like a secret she'd taught herself to hide. Dr. Chen was already moving. "Crash cart!" His voice cracked across the bay with a metallic tang of controlled panic. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as Chen's team pushed fluids into the commander's arm, their movements practiced and fast. Epinephrine. 2 rounds. The heart monitor beeped its chaotic rhythm, tachycardia climbing toward the ceiling, 142, 156, 168. The man's blood pressure was cratering. 70/40. Then lower. 58/30. "Get me a cardio consult," Chen called out, his jaw tight. Someone qualified for advanced intervention. Laura was 2 steps behind the crash cart, watching the monitor with the particular clarity that came from having held dying men's chests open in field hospitals where the electricity was a Honda generator and the surgical lights were flashlights duct taped to tent poles. She knew that rhythm. She knew what it meant. She knew what came next. Dr. Ashford appeared in the trauma bay doorway like a shadow made flesh, his presence moving the air the way a predator's presence changes everything around it, the nurses suddenly more cautious, their movement smaller. He was still in his scrubs from the day shift, which meant he'd stayed. He'd been here. Waiting, perhaps, for something like this. For leverage. For a moment where his institutional weight could be measured against someone else's life. "I'll coordinate the consults," Ashford said smoothly, pulling out his phone. "This case requires specialist input." Laura watched his fingers move across the screen. 12 calls, she counted. 12 separate conversations, each one lasting exactly 30 seconds. His voice was different on each call, not angry, never raised, never demanding. That was the artistry of it. He phrased each consultation as a careful concern. Liability questions on this one, she heard him tell the first attending physician. Found collapsed. Unknown exposure history. High risk of multi-system involvement. I'm personally recommending caution on case acceptance until we have full tox screens and anaphylaxis etiology. The first doctor declined. The second call, unstable presentation. Possible drug interaction component. I'd hate to see you inherit responsibility for a case with this many complicating factors. The second doctor hung up. By the fourth call, Laura understood. Ashford wasn't asking these physicians to treat the commander. He was constructing a wall. A fortress made of manufactured liability concerns and carefully planted doubt, each brick perfectly shaped to fit the next. His voice remained calm throughout, almost friendly. That was what made it devastating. He sounded like he was protecting them. 12 attending physicians, she heard him say to Chen, after the last call ended and his phone returned to his pocket. Every qualified cardiologist within the hospital's network. Every single one has expressed concerns about assuming liability on this case given the presentation factors and incomplete diagnostic picture. 12. The number hung in the air like a verdict. The monitor's alarm escalated. The commander's rhythm had shifted, not the organized chaos of tachycardia anymore, but the wild electrical storm of ventricular fibrillation. V-fib. The flatline's violent cousin. The rhythm that meant the heart had stopped contracting and was only twitching, useless, the whole organ firing in patterns that pumped nothing, moved nothing, saved nothing. Defibrillator! Chen shouted. The crash team moved as one. Paddles came out, were coated with ultrasound gel. 200 joules. The commander's body convulsed upward off the table like a puppet on strings. The monitor showed the jolt's impact, a brief reorganization of the chaos, then the V-fib reasserted itself, worse now, more aggressive. Escalating. 360 joules. Nothing. Laura could feel the medical window closing. Could feel the exact moment when a life stops being savable and starts being unsavable, that invisible boundary that exists for maybe 5 minutes at the best, maybe 2 if the arrest wasn't witnessed, if the heart had already been beating wrong for a while before collapse. The brain was dying. The organs were dying. Every second that the commander's heart wasn't contracting meant 30 seconds worth of cellular death in the tissues downstream. He needs a thoracotomy, Laura said. Her voice was even. The anaphylaxis created massive fluid response. Cardiac tamponade. His heart can't beat against the pressure. Standard resuscitation won't work. Ashford turned to her. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, flat and cold. Step back from the cart, Nurse Bennett. You're not qualified for this level of intervention. Doctor, he needs. I said step back. But Laura didn't step back. She moved forward instead, her hand finding the scalpel in the crash cart by muscle memory, the same way her hand had found it in the field hospital in Marjah, in 2010, when Sergeant Martinez had taken a blast and the conventional interventions had failed and the only thing between him and death was a surgical knife and someone willing to cut. She'd learned then that qualifications were a luxury that didn't exist in the places where people actually needed saving. She'd learned that panic was information. Pain was information. And blood pooling around a heart was information that said move. The scalpel's handle was exactly where it should be. This procedure requires a cardiothoracic surgeon, Ashford said, his voice sharper now. Something had shifted in him, the smooth mast slipping for just an instant, showing the raw edge of his control starting to fray. You will step away from that cart immediately, or I will have security remove you. Chen stood frozen between them, his hands hovering over the commander's chest, his eyes moving from Ashford to Laura like he was watching a collision about to happen. The monitor screamed. Laura could see the unit patch in the commander's jacket now, clearly visible where the fabric had torn. That eagle and anchor. That specific configuration of wings and iron, 17 years old and worn thin by hands that had held it close. The same unit she'd come out of. The same unit that officially didn't exist, the operation in Marjah that had been classified so far beyond standard confidentiality that she'd been erased from every public record, every official roster, turned into a ghost in the machinery of the government's own databases just to keep the mission compartmentalized. And now that ghost was looking at a man wearing the insignia from that invisible unit, a man whose heart was in V-fib, a man she was supposed to walk away from because a surgeon in an expensive suit said so. Ashford reached for his radio. "You can fire me after I save his life," Laura said. She said it the way a knife enters skin, with absolutely no hesitation, no equivocation, no expectation of response. She said it like someone who understood that some moments required you to choose between obedience and meaning. She grabbed the scalpel. The incision went left mid-axillary line, below the fourth rib. Skin. Fascia. Muscle. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of apex predators, 18 combat saves worth of muscle memory taking over completely. There was no room for doubt in this moment, no space for hesitation. The breath she'd learned in Marjah flowed through her, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse, that comes from standing in a place where death was simply another patient in the room, waiting his turn. Security to Trauma Bay 3. Immediately, Ashford's voice crackled across the radio. Blood. The hiss of air escaping where her scalpel had made the opening. The ribs were next, the spreader coming out, opening the chest cavity with a sound like a door with broken hinges. The pericardium, the membrane around the heart, was distended, bloated with blood. Tamponade. The pressure around the heart was preventing it from beating. That was the information the commander's body had been screaming for the past 4 minutes. Laura's knife opened it. The blood released like a valve turning. 300 milliliters of fluid that shouldn't have been there, draining into the surgical field, relieving the pressure that had been strangling the heart. Her hands found the commander's heart in its cavity. Room temperature muscle. Still in that useless V-fib pattern, twitching like a fist clenching and unclenching without purpose. She compressed it manually. Once. Twice. Squeeze and release. Squeeze and release. Hands that had held lives together were holding a life together now, the commander's own heart beating against her palm, slowly finding rhythm because the pressure was gone, because someone had cut through the things preventing it from working. The monitor beeped. Sinus rhythm. Weak at first, then stronger. The organized electrical pattern that meant a heart remembering how to beat. The commander's blood pressure climbed. 60/40. 70/50. Moving back toward the land of the living, toward the world where people woke up and asked questions and held on to the things that mattered. Ashford stood in the doorway, his face the color of old bone, his mouth open slightly as if he'd started to say something and then forgotten how language worked. Chen stared at Laura's hands. At her face. At the absolute absence of tremor or uncertainty in either. His eyes moved to the monitor showing sinus rhythm, real rhythm, heart rhythm, the rhythm that meant she'd done it, and then back to Laura. "Get me a chest tube," she said calmly. "Size 36 French. And notify surgery. He's going to need proper closure, but he's going to live long enough to get it." The next voice that came through the radio was security's acknowledgement. En route to Trauma Bay 3. Laura didn't look up from the commander's open chest. She didn't break eye contact with his heart beating in her hands. She said, very quietly, "I'm going on break after this. I need some coffee." Chen almost laughed. It came out as a sound somewhere between relief and hysteria, but it came out. The crash cart collided with her shin as she pulled it from the alcove, but she didn't break stride. The monitor screamed its flatline wail, a sound like a siren buried under water. Her hands moved on their own, each motion precise as a prayer, the way her combat medic instructor had drilled it into muscle memory 8 years ago on the red dust of Marjah. Scalpel. 14-gauge needle. The surgical tray clattered open beside the commander's still form. Dr. Chen stood frozen 3 feet away, his mouth open like a man watching someone walk into traffic. "Laura, you can't." "Tape," she said. Not a question. A command. The trauma team scattered, then reorganized around her. Someone thrust surgical tape into her waiting hand. Laura didn't look up. She was already reading the anatomy like a map she'd memorized in another lifetime, 3rd and 4th intercostal space, midclavicular line, the thin membrane of skin that separated this man from death. She could feel Ashford's presence before she saw him. Cold air moving. A shadow in her peripheral vision. She didn't acknowledge it. The scalpel went in with the precision of someone who had cut through worse than tissue. The incision was clean, deliberate, maybe 3 inches long, her hand steady as surgical steel. Blood bloomed across the commander's chest, but there was already so little left in him that it looked almost dilute, watered red against pale skin. She opened the pericardium with a clamp, the sound of forceps clicking in the silence. 1 instrument. 2. The rib spreader deployed with a mechanical whisper, spreading the chest cavity open like an oyster shell. And there it was. The heart. Grey-blue, motionless, a fist that had forgotten how to clench. Laura's hand entered the chest cavity. The sensation was familiar in the way a nightmare can be familiar. She had done this exactly once before, in a convoy that had taken fire outside Sanjin Valley while the sun hammered down like a curse. That soldier had lived. This one would too. Not because she was a nurse. Because she was a major, and majors didn't leave Marines behind. 1,000. 2,000. Her hand compressed the heart muscle with rhythmic certainty, manually forcing blood through chambers that had surrendered. 30 seconds. Her eyes fixed on the monitor. The flat line persisted. She didn't slow. 60 seconds. There a flutter. The monitor hiccuped once, uncertain, like a sleeper trying to wake. She maintained compression, her shoulders flexed, her breathing controlled. 90 seconds. The heart muscle beneath her palm responded. Not a strong response. A tentative one. But real. The monitor beeped. A single, fragile rhythm. Then another. Then steady. "We have sinus," someone whispered. Laura didn't answer. She was already pulling her hand back, already reaching for the surgical thread, her fingers steady as she began closing the pericardium with methodical precision. Suture after suture. The room had gone quiet except for the monitor's reassuring pulse, a sound like life itself, ticking back into existence. She didn't look toward the door, but she heard the intake of breath. Ashford. There. His phone was already in his hand. "This is medical malpractice," he said, his voice sharp and high. "I am documenting every second." "Security. I'm calling security right now." Laura placed the final suture without responding. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge that he existed. She simply finished her work as she always did, methodical, precise, as if she were alone in the room. The surgical dressing went on smooth and clean. She stripped off her gloves in one fluid motion, the latex making that distinctive snap as it came away from her skin. Security arrived within minutes. 2 officers, both carrying the particular energy of men who didn't want to be there. The lead officer was a Marine. Based on his posture, she could tell by the way he stood, weight-balanced, ready to move in any direction. He would understand, eventually. Not today, but eventually. "Nurse Bennett, you need to come with us," he said, and his voice held no anger. "Just protocol." She set down her instruments on the sterile field, turned away from the commander's stable vital signs, and walked out between the 2 officers without a word. The hallway fluorescent light seemed brighter in the silence. Her scrubs had blood on them, not much, but visible, a dark stain against the blue fabric like a bruise that hadn't quite formed yet. The HR office occupied the 3rd floor, a maze of cubicles and conference rooms designed to feel professional and soulless in equal measure. The walls were a color that some designer had probably called warm gray but which actually looked like surrender. Ms. Vance, the HR director, sat behind a desk cluttered with files and a framed photo of her own children. 2 kids, both smiling, both ignorant of how the world actually worked. "Have a seat, Laura," Ms. Vance said. Not Laura. Nurse Bennett. Just Laura. The diminishment was intentional. Laura Saturday. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She didn't shake. Didn't blink rapidly. Didn't do any of the small nervous behaviors that guilt was supposed to produce. She simply sat there like stone while Miss Vance read from a printed statement, her voice the flat effect of someone reciting a script for the 100th time. Practicing outside your scope of practice. Unauthorized surgical intervention. Insubordination. Your employment with Sacred Heart Medical Center is terminated effective immediately. Your badge is deactivated as of this moment. Security will escort you to collect your personal items from your locker and then to your vehicle. Laura held out her hand. The badge dangled from her neck on a lanyard. 3 years of quiet work, 3 years of being invisible, 3 years of keeping her head down and her history buried. She unclipped it, and the small badge slipped into Miss Vance's open palm like a confession. The officers escorted her downstairs. No one looked at her as she passed through the hospital corridors. The staff moved around her the way water moved around a stone, acknowledging her presence without really seeing it. She retrieved a jacket from her locker in the break room. Inside the pocket, her fingers found the faded unit patch, sewn into the lining years ago, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Her unit. Her identity. Still there. Still hers. The parking garage smelled like motor oil and rain that hadn't fallen yet. Her car was a 2015 Honda Civic, nothing remarkable, nothing that would draw attention. The officers waited until she unlocked the door, then nodded once, a gesture that seemed almost like respect, and walked back toward the hospital entrance. She sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and her hands gripping the steering wheel. The engine wasn't running. The keys were in the ignition, but she couldn't seem to make her hands turn them. The fluorescent lights of the parking structure buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and the sound seemed to fill the entire space. 2 hours. That's how long she sat there. 2 hours without moving, without crying, without doing anything at all except breathing and feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into her chest like a second heartbeat. Her phone rang at 6:15 p.m. Marcus. Her 17-year-old son, probably calling from school, probably wondering why she wasn't home yet, probably standing in some hallway worrying about his mother the way all children worry about their parents when something doesn't make sense. She didn't answer. She let the call go to voicemail, and when it rang again at 6:22, she still didn't answer. What could she tell him? That she'd been fired? That she'd broken every protocol, every rule, every law that governed what a nurse could do? That she'd saved a man's life and destroyed her own career in the same minute? Her hands finally obeyed her at 6:38 p.m. The engine started. The car pulled out of the parking space. She drove home on highways she didn't remember, through intersections she barely saw, her body operating on autopilot while her mind stayed frozen somewhere in that trauma bay, somewhere in the moment when she'd reached into another person's chest and held their heartbeat in her hand. She parked in her driveway without recalling the journey. The house was dark. Marcus wasn't home yet. She sat on the porch steps in the fading light and waited for her 17-year-old to come save her, though she knew he was still just a child and that wasn't his job. The next morning would bring the board meeting. The next morning would bring her son walking through those conference room doors with a shadow box of medals and a truth that couldn't stay hidden anymore. The next morning would bring the uniforms and the Navy SEAL and the FBI liaison and the moment when Major Laura Bennett stopped being a ghost and became visible again. But for now, in the darkness of this parking garage and the darker silence of her car, she simply sat and remembered Marjah and held the knowledge that she had done the right thing. The conference room at Sacred Heart was the kind of space designed to intimidate. Mahogany table stretching 12 feet. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. 10 board members arranged in high-backed leather chairs, their tablets already glowing with case files. Dr. Ashford sat near the head of the table, his posture relaxed, one hand wrapped around a ceramic mug of coffee. He'd survived 48 hours of internal investigations. He'd survived worse. The board chair, Dr. Ellis, called the meeting to order at 9 in the morning. Outside, Norfolk fog rolled off the water like something alive. Ashford smiled. He was explaining his concerns about scope creep when the conference room doors burst open. Not slammed. Burst. The sound was a crack like a rifle shot, and every board member flinched. Marcus Bennett stood in the doorway, 17 years old, his lanky frame filling the space with the kind of quiet rage that only teenage conviction produces. His hands gripped a shadow box. Mahogany frame. Glass front. Inside, medals arranged on navy velvet. Silver. Bronze. Ribbon colors. His voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. "Mom, they need to see these." He stepped forward. "You don't have to hide anymore." Laura stood from her chair, the one they'd given her, near the back, the visitor's seat, and for the first time in 6 years, she moved like what she actually was. Not a cardiology nurse. Not just someone anyone had underestimated. Marcus crossed the room and placed the shadow box in the center of the mahogany table. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that happens when the air pressure changes. When the understanding shifts. The board chair's hands trembled as she lifted the shadow box. Dr. Ellis's eye scanned the medals, then found the citation card mounted beneath them. She read aloud, her voice steady but quiet, the way people speak in the presence of something sacred. Major Laura Bennett. Silver Star. For gallantry in action against an armed enemy of the United States, Marjah, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, March 2012. For extraordinary heroism and decisive leadership under fire, protecting personnel, maintaining operational integrity, and she stopped. Looked up. This is a Silver Star. This is combat heroism. The conference room door opened again. A man in dress blues walked in. Not crisp the way most military dress is crisp. This was the uniform of someone who'd worn it in the field, whose rank, Navy SEAL commander insignia on his shoulder, meant he'd seen things the board members couldn't imagine. His name was Carter. He'd flown in from the Pentagon at 0600 that morning. Behind him came another man, younger, wearing a Marine Corps veteran cap that said Fallujah, 2007, in faded lettering. Jack Ramos. Hospital IT specialist. His cap sat crooked on his head like he'd been wearing it for 20 years without taking it off. Commander Carter placed a tablet on the table. Security footage began playing. Dr. Ashford in the hospital hallway. Phone to his ear. His voice came through the speakers, calibrated, precise, each word chosen with the care of someone manufacturing a defense. "Yes, I have concerns about liability exposure with this particular patient. The case history suggests malpractice risk. I'd recommend declining involvement." Frame after frame. 12 different calls. 12 physicians blocked by a man who'd built his sabotage on bureaucratic precision. His voice never raised. Never broke. Just methodical. Systematic. Professional. That was what made it worse. Dr. Ellis's face turned the color of storm clouds. "Dr. Ashford, you deliberately prevented treatment of a critical patient." Ashford started to speak. His mouth opened. Words began to form. But Commander Carter raised one hand, a gesture so natural, so commanding, that his authority didn't need volume. "There's more," Carter said. Her voice was a tank idling in a garage. Enormous. Capable. This morning at 0630 hours, Dr. Ashford accessed the hospital security system from his office computer. He attempted to delete all footage from Trauma Bay 3. She nodded toward the corner of the room. Jack Ramos stepped forward. His boots on the marble tile made a sound like the beginning of something inevitable. He wore his Marine Corps veteran cap the way some people wore medals. "I saved every frame," Ramos said. His eyes never left Ashford's face. "When I saw what he was trying to erase, I reported it to IT security immediately. Marines take care of Marines." Then he turned toward Laura. His entire posture shifted. Respect. Not the kind offered to hierarchy or position. The kind earned in fire. "I recognized the thoracotomy technique. My combat medic did the same procedure for me in Fallujah, 2004. Left anterolateral approach. Manual cardiac massage. That's not something you learn in civilian medicine. That's combat medicine. That's survival medicine." He paused. "You saved that man's life with your hands." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Ms. Vance from Human Resources was reading something on her tablet, her face turning grey. The Medicare billing records. Every fraudulent entry Ashford had made across 18 months. $52,000 in overbilled procedures. The falsified write-ups that had been filed against Laura, all fabrications, all documented in our own system, all traceable back to Ashford's computer. The reassignments designed to isolate her. The strategic decisions to move her from day shift to night shift on the precise day the commander arrived. Dr. Ashford, Ms. Vance said quietly, you used my department to manufacture false documentation. You used my staff as tools in a retaliation campaign. The hospital attorney was leaning toward Dr. Ellis, whispering urgently. Their conversation was inaudible, but Ashford's face was changing. Not the confidence now. Something else. Something like the color draining from a corpse. He tried one more defense, his voice smaller now, thinner. She accessed confidential patient files without authorization. She violated HIPAA by. You left your tablet unlocked, Commander Carter interrupted, in a public break room displaying Medicare fraud. Major Bennett's observation of your crime doesn't justify institutional retaliation. It doesn't justify blocking 12 physicians from treating a critical patient. It doesn't justify the character assassination campaign, the fraudulent documentation, or the attempted destruction of evidence. She paused. One breath. It makes you a criminal. The state medical board representative made notes. Her pen scratched across her tablet in a sound that seemed very loud. The hospital board voted. 10 board members. 10 votes. All the same direction. Unanimous. Immediate termination. License review. Criminal investigation referral to the Norfolk Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The vote took 90 seconds. Ashford was escorted from the building by the same security officers who deactivated Laura's badge. He moved like a man walking through water, his steps disconnected from intention. The mahogany conference room doors closed behind him. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. The moment that changed everything came 3 minutes later, when Commander Rourke, the unconscious Marine who'd coded, who'd flatlined, who should have died on the trauma bay tile while 12 doctors refused to help, walked through those same doors on his own 2 feet. His left arm was in a sling. His face was pale. But he was walking. His uniform was dress blues. His boots were polished. He crossed the conference room and stopped in front of Laura. His hand extended. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone who'd been dead and was still breathing. Major Bennett, he said, you saved my life. Laura took his hand. Her grip was steady. The way she'd learned to hold things in Marjah. The way she'd learned to hold her composure when everything was burning. Welcome back, Commander, she said. 8 words. Perfect precision. 6 months passed like seasons turning. Laura walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance wearing scrubs again. Not the cardiology unit anymore. The emergency department. Director of Emergency Medical Training. Her office overlooked the trauma bays, all 4 of them, the windows positioned so she could see everything. Command position. Accountability position. The position of someone who'd finally stopped hiding. Her ID badge hung around her neck. Her real name printed on white laminate. No longer invisible. No longer erased. Commander Rourke had recovered fully. His arm regained strength. His tactical readiness restored. Before he deployed again, he'd left something in her office. A shadow box. Smaller than Marcus's. Inside was a single faded unit patch. The emblem was barely visible, time and sand and 6 years in a jacket lining had worn it almost invisible. But it matched the one she kept in a drawer in her home office. The Marjah patch. The one that said they'd been there together. The note inside Rourke's shadow box read, "We were there together. Thank you for being there again." His signature. His rank. His gratitude carved into penmanship. She'd placed it on her office shelf. right where she could see it. Marcus visited her at lunch on a Tuesday. Pre-med student now. Auburn University. His anatomy class was studying the cardiovascular system. He wanted to talk about surgical technique. They sat in the break room, the same break room where staff had once fled the moment she sat down, and now nurses waved at him. Residents asked her questions. A young intern brought her a coffee without being asked. The space was warm. Warm with something like respect. Through the window, across the street, Laura could see a strip mall. There was a folding table set up underneath a flapping insurance company banner. A man sat behind it, loosening his tie in the Norfolk heat. Dr. Ashford. Medical license suspended. Facing criminal charges. Now selling health insurance to people who crossed the parking lot. People who mostly ignored him. She watched for exactly 5 seconds. Felt the ghost of anger move through her and dissolve. Then she turned back to Marcus, and they talked about coronary arteries and valve function, and she smiled at her son's questions because he was going to be the kind of doctor who saw people. Who actually saw them. 3 weeks after the board meeting, a Marine arrived in the ER with shrapnel wounds from a training accident. Laura scrubbed in without hesitation. The same thoracotomy. The same technique learned in Marjah. The same hands. Except this time, her team was around her, trauma surgeons, perfusionists, nurses trained by her protocols, and her real name was on the surgical report. Major Laura Bennett. Combat trained. Combat experienced. No longer erased. The Marine lived. He'd be fine. He'd deploy. He'd come home. That evening, as Laura left the hospital, a medical resident stopped her in the hallway. The young woman's badge said Dr. Sarah Chen, MD, PGY01. She was trembling slightly, the way first-year residents do when they're standing next to someone who matters. Dr. Ellis told us what you did, Chen said. Who you really are. How did you stay quiet for so long? Laura adjusted her ID badge, her credentials finally visible, her military rank no longer buried under scrubs and erasure. She met Chen's eyes. Steady. Present. Allowed to exist. I didn't stay quiet, she said. I stayed ready. The evening drive home took her past the harbor. Norfolk's skyline was turning colors that had no names. Orange bleeding into gold. The kind of light that comes once a day and never comes again. Her dashboard had a sticky note taped to it. Marcus had left it there. Just 2 words. Her old call sign from Marjah. The one that meant something. Lionheart. She smiled. Started the engine. Drove home. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. If this story hit you, if you saw yourself in Laura's composure or in that moment of choosing to be ready instead of breaking, then you know what I'm asking. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. And in the comments, tell me, when have you stayed quiet but stayed ready? When have you held your composure while everything around you was trying to make you break? Because that's where real heroism lives. Not in the loud moments. In the quiet ones.